keep filtering in. Find your seats, please. The lights are bright. I know what a deer feels like now. All right, well, I hope you all had a great break, a good chance to network again. Hopefully you all had a chance to reconnect or to meet new folks. We're going to continue that after today's events as well. So we'll give you one more opportunity after this. In the meantime, we're about to get started with another exciting session. I've got one or two quick logistics points that I just want to address. First of all, if you have to take a phone call, we'd ask that you either go out and all the way back up to the Paradise Plaza, or if you go out here up to the second floor. And that's for your own sake, because I've heard that if you take a phone call on that alcove there, everybody on the other side of the door hears what you're saying. So no matter how quiet you've been trying to be, unfortunately, your phone calls have been heard by the folks that have been listening over there. So take it out a little bit further out and you won't run into that risk. But now let's move to the next topic, which is BES cyber system information on the cloud. And happy to have a set of panelists here that have a lot of great experience in this topic. So I'm excited to hear the conversation. I want to welcome Brent Sessions, the VP of Reliability Compliance at WAPA, and Morgan Kane, WEC Senior Technical Advisor of Entity Monitoring. Gentlemen.
Testing. All right. How you doing, everybody? I don't talk soft. I think you figured that out by now. I want to talk a little bit about BCSI and information in the cloud. I kind of want to set it up just a little bit today, because we had a situation where we were doing some research, various people actually in WEC and MRO and at NERC, wondering, what might it look like if some auditors just come and take a look at a cloud environment? What pitfalls are we going to find? What kind of traps might there be? What rabbit holes are we going to go down? What are the risks presented? And we started looking and we really couldn't find anything. I don't know, maybe some folks here have been able to find some information, but we haven't really found anything concrete that's a document that's going to go out there that might give me some useful information on what to expect on how some of this might actually go. So that led to what this project was, which we ended up, we're working through the NERC Security Working Group, which is actually who I'm here to represent today. And we want to bring you this information today. So I'm hoping that this is something that you guys are going to find engaging for everybody. So you can go ahead and do the slides. All right, this one. Okay, so what we did and decided to do is a tabletop exercise. Okay, that's the summary. I'm not aware of anybody else doing something like this. So I'm hoping that down the road, that when this document and our document set is released and gets approved through NERC, that this is going to be useful information for everybody. But one of the driving reasons is that, I don't know if you've heard, there's this thing called the cloud out there, and it's like a bunch of stuff out there and in some country around the internet that you may have sensitive information on. At least hopefully if you have sensitive information on it. Maybe some of you have been afraid to go into such an environment because you don't know what either the risks are, the compliance risks are, or the actual compliant issues that may come up, what they might be. Okay. However, the industry is clearly going there. This is a multi-billion-dollar industry, and it seems pretty clear that the momentum is toward going to the cloud. So that was one of the other major drivers that we had.
Couple things on that. So in 2014-15, NERC held some roundtables with some cloud service providers to so that they could learn what the ERO enterprise does, and also we could learn from those cloud service providers. And then after that, come 2019, we had the standard authorization request that noted some of the issues with SIP 4-6 and SIP 11-2 that was causing some issues for entities moving their BCSI in the cloud environment. And then 2020, we had FERC's notice of inquiry, which requested information related to virtualization and cloud services. So that's kind of an aspect of the groundswell into moving this project forward.
Already flipped. Go ahead. Okay.
Oh, it's you.
Oh, it's me.
Yep.
It's me. We had rehearsed this closely, as you can tell. So we reached out at WAPA, Western Area Power Administration. We're part of the Department of Energy. And I started talking to my contacts at WEC. I started talking to, at the time, we were working with Microsoft on our first cloud implementation for various services, NERC and MRO, because WAPA actually crosses NERC and MRO. All of them were really supportive of the idea of we had no idea what would happen if we just showed up, we set up an environment and we looked at all the controls and we used the RSAWs and we kind of go through the methodology. What's going to fall out? I mean, we had no idea. And so really what this is this is a version 1 learning experience for everyone involved. And I really want to thank NERC, WEC, Microsoft, and MRO for being really supportive. All of them provided folks to work with on this. It happened a little while ago, but it's taken a lot of work for us to get here. And the nice part is I think we got a lot of the dirty work done, at least for this particular implementation. So again, we were unable to find solid examples of what a visit from an audit team might look like, right? I know that everyone's afraid to go out there with their real stuff and then get pounded with all kinds of stuff that looks horrible. You can't control access, you can't do this, you can't do that. What is going to happen, right? But there were a lot of unanswered questions about the process and what the audit approach might be. What is the evidence going to look like? Do I have to come up with reams and reams of paper? Is it all screenshots? Am I doing reports? You know, what does this look like, right? And so not only what compliance issues come up, but what general risk issues come up. Because as you know, there's some unique things about cloud service providers, and then how do we control those, right? And the other thing is that if I want to look at my particular implementation, because I don't know if you guys have figured out yet, but there's like millions of ways that you can implement this. You can pick any security framework you want. You can pick any environment that you want. You can pick any service that you want. So we decided just to put one toe into the water, just very, very simple. And in this case, we used a Microsoft Azure environment with what they call a data blob. It's really just a storage area that we just threw some fake documentation in a non-production environment. We were working on it anyway. Microsoft was kind enough to help us get that set up so that there was zero chance of us having an actual compliance issue. I didn't want to put the auditors into a situation where suddenly they're bringing up all of my SIP2 information by accident. That would not be good. So we made sure that that was not going to happen. But how long would this going to take? All right, when you actually do a tabletop. So we're looking for traps and issues that can't be resolved. And that's all part of like what's driving us as in WAPA core value is that we have a core value of be curious, learn more, do better, and repeat. And it turns out that, WEC, MRO, and Microsoft and the ERO all have those similar kind of values. Because, we see weird stuff. We like to fix it, right? I think that's kind of clear with this crowd. So we thought the strategy might be, if we're going to assess a really unique environment, then we should figure out a process, a repeatable, documented process that entities can follow to make it really efficient. So they know what steps to take, how to organize it, what the timeframes are, blah, blah, blah. And then they can run that against their own environment so that they understand where their traps might be. We had a Microsoft with Azure, all right, in a FedRAMP environment. There's a lot of other folks that aren't going to do it that way. That's what we had. So we decided, well, let's just try something. So we did that as a prototype, right? We want to determine what the risks are for our entity in order to do that. So we came up with a process document. We have a list of that experience of what happened during it. There's key takeaways that we're going to get into here in a couple minutes about some of the major things to keep track of. What evidence was presented, like what kinds of stuff did we bring to the table? And then also from the ERO, they had their piece on this too. So Morgan's going to be presenting on what the risks are in general that the ER says that they are going to pay attention to, basically, and some things that we need to be aware of if you're going to move in this direction. What we came up with is actually a shared document package. So we had to work with Microsoft as a vendor because they have their policies and their contracts and stuff like that. So we work with them. This has all been cleared by lawyers. And then we also worked with the ERO, who they own and approve their own documentation. We don't control that. but you have to read everything. When it comes out, you'll see, you'll need to read it together. And there's actually mappings between all the pieces of this documentation when it's, when it actually comes out. I will mention also that the exercise was 100% virtual. So there was no travel time. This was relatively easy to set up and execute. So it was conducted right in the middle of COVID, May 20th, 2020. It was very limited in scope. It's just to SIP4 and SIP11. Why? Because I had some fake stuff in this cloud environment. We weren't going to get into this whole big, long production. We want to figure out these are the two issues that we have. And it turns out these are key issues about the protection that's required by SIP11 and the access control and how that fits into our access control program, or how it might fit into anybody's access control program. So we did the RSAWs, those were reviewed, and there was a lot of questions about understanding the environment. I think you may get into this, but at the time we found out that the folks like from NERC and from WEC and MRO had never actually seen what a cloud environment even looks like, what kind of screens you can get, how you can do, how do you guys monitor this day to day, right? They had not ever seen that. Well, if an auditor has more idea of what this looks like, they're going to do a better job auditing, which is going to be more efficient for everybody. I think we can all agree with that. So it was, I want to, it was an exercise. Okay. It's not an audit. It wasn't an audit, and it's something or for self-reports. This is a version 1 prototype to figure out kind of how can it go, and then how can we take an iterative process. We can learn from this side, or we learn from what we did this time, then apply it back to the process document, and then make it better next time, so that another entity that wants to try this can learn what we learned and improve it. And over time, the strategy is that we start teaching ourselves more as an industry about how we can have a safe and secure cloud environment for BCSI that will also be compliant and meet all the risks that we need to meet. All right. So it was a learning experience. I'm going to say this a lot. It was not, that does not mean it was perfect. Okay. We know that there are unanswered questions, but I had lots of help in helping us write this document package. In particular, Alice Ireland's group in the security working group, who took a really tough eye on this and beat me up pretty good on some stuff. And we got that fixed. So thank you, Alice. That's going to say up front, and your team. But as it says in the last line, first and foremost, this is a learning experience. So that's what we're trying to bring you here today.
Yeah, as mentioned, this was specific, considering all the myriad of ways an entity could implement the service they could choose. As Brent mentioned, we kept this pretty simple. There were 14 participants, SMEs from WAPA. There was 5 from the ERO, and there was 3 SMEs from Microsoft. And so really the valuable part of this was understanding what considerations the entity made when they were looking at moving or migrating or adapting to the cloud. And then also how to evaluate this. What's the best approach in evaluating it? And then obviously auditing. And you'll hear us mention this a couple times, but this is just the first step. We're really hopeful, based on the package that's moving forward through the RSTC, that another industry group or an entity can move what they're considering their project in through this tabletop exercise as well, and not just for BCSI. As you noticed from the FERC NOI, they were asking information about considering virtualization and also cloud services. And NERC responded to that NOI supportive, just stating at the end that we haven't received any SAR for that to move it forward.
Okay, so we started the whole exercise with the industry team led with the introduction of the RSAWs. We talked to the RSAWs, so far pretty normal of what was in there for SIP6 and SIP11. We did use the vendor narrative. So we had the narrative kind of divided into 2 pieces in the RSAW. This is what WAPA did, and this is what Microsoft does for their security procedures within the cloud. Now, in the learning experience, we understood that this was good to have at first. Down the road, I think when people learn more about how this actually all works, that may not be necessary in the future. And that's one of the lessons that we actually recorded in this document package. But the RSAWs, as usual, give the auditors the context, and it's helpful to understand the qualities and the capabilities of the vendor environment. And so there's a couple of links up here is that, what we relied on also was Microsoft has the 2 links here about their SIP standards and cloud computing and the cloud implementation guidance for NERC audits, which are both out there. Those links, I checked them last week and they're still good. Thank you, Microsoft. Okay. And from the ERO Enterprise team notes, the RSAWs were underlay focused. And you may want to explain a little bit the underlay versus the overlay just briefly, in addition to the entity environment specific. So that's called the overlay. So basically, if something is FedRAMP, that's the underlay. That's where we're required as a federal agency to use FedRAMP. So that was obvious for us. But don't forget is that we're still responsible for the access. So how does that work? Especially the access into the BCSI. So the SIP4 questions and how the role encryption played were a big part of these conversations. Do you want to add anything to that at this point? So we had, and we did this with DRs. We did this, there were some follow-up DRs. We did this kind of as a standard type of audit exercise, but I'd say overall it took an afternoon, it's about 4 hours. Some really excellent conversation that took place. I mean, it wasn't a huge, long, multi-week giant thing that had to occur. And that's what we're going for here. Something you can do that's relatively fast and easy, you get a lot of information out of.
Just one thing on that.
Yes.
It wasn't 4 hours of reviewing just the evidence. There was over 75 files of evidence in reviewing from the cloud service provider, between the cloud service provider and the entity. So it took some resources to create the evidence and then to obviously review.
I want to mention, we did provide them through a file server that we had the opportunity them about a week in advance to review those RSAWs and look at the evidence that we had provided on that. Again, that's kind of the standard process, but that was key to actually having an efficient meeting when you actually perform the exercise and the questions are actually asked. That is captured in the process document. It's also captured in the document that gets into our key takeaways. So when that comes out, that'll be in there. So the overall process, you collaborate, right? We collaborate with WEC, MRO, FERC, and NERC and Microsoft. We came up with a very initial tabletop exercise process document, version 1. We set up a fake data and non-production environment. All right, we organized and performed the exercise. Okay, that was the document review. That was the exercise. That was the whole deal. And then we documented the experience and then used that information to go back into that initial process document and improve that process. All right. We created a document package with that experience for the industry, genericizing everything, get everything cleared, get everybody to approve it. And that's where we're moving through right now and at NERC. And then rinse and repeat. We want to take the experience and feed it back into the process. So we want someone else to do this, maybe with their environment. Maybe they want to use AWS. Maybe they want to use some other third-party provider. That's not on that. We would like you to take this process and apply it and run it at your entity, and then take what information you can give back to the industry, and then use that to improve the process document. That's the idea. Because the more we do this, the more we all learn. The more when we can learn about other possibilities and better ways to do things, right? And then we're managing the version control and all that stuff through the NERC security working group and the ERO. That's how it's going today. So more of the juicy stuff, I guess. Here's the key takeaways, all right? This isn't the document itself. The document is in draft, but I did want to pull out just some of the summary of the key documentation that is in this, that you're going to find when the document package comes out. The CSP documentation we did find valuable to understand the cloud environment. How does the CSP control access for their people? How does encryption used? What happens to your data if you terminate your contract and you're in your subscription? Those kind of things were really good to have. And that's what the ERO is talking about, is understanding the qualities and sort of the makeup and how the CSP works. I think it's important to understand that you as the entity, you're the ones that bought the service. So to some extent, you have to know what it is you bought and how it works. and then what the limitations of that are. Now, maybe that's obvious, but I think it's worth saying because that's really important. The same goes for the underlay. Just because it's a FedRAMP environment, and FedRAMP basically is a federal cybersecurity framework management environment. But it doesn't mean that I just get as WAPA just to get to say, well, they do all that computer stuff and I don't have to worry about it. Right. The internet is littered with the destruction of, federal agencies that just kind of throw it over the fence and don't worry about it. This is not going to work that way. NERC is too smart for that. So what they're going to expect to know is that the entity they are auditing understands what it is they bought, how access is controlled, and how it fits into their access control program, and how they do manage access into these environments by the CSP, how that's done. Do we know what's supposed to happen under what conditions? So the CSP engagement for this first exercise was really important. And Microsoft, we had somebody working with us hand in hand. It was really good. Microsoft had never been through a NERC audit, by the way, I might add, not like this. So they walked away going, oh, they had one of those kind of moments. Oh, so they really do ask that stuff. I mean, you were serious about that? It's like one of those things, right? And so they walked away going, okay, now we have a much better idea of how that works, who roles and responsibilities are, what kind of position, frankly, do they want to be in an audit? Do they want to be at every audit for every entity? I doubt it. But they had a much better idea of now what they can provide the people, the customers buying their service, and how to get that done efficiently. The terminology is really different between the NERC, the responsible RE responsible entity, and the CSP. So care to make sure to describe carefully the functionality and the environment, right? To a person working in the cloud, backups do not mean like tapes and you have somebody flipping tapes, or you have something, to them it's an application, which is a completely different way of thinking about how you do subscription services. Firewalls are all virtual, everything's virtual. They see everything as a service. Okay, so there's a lot of differences in that. We found out that you have to be very clear on exactly what you're talking about. Restriction to access to certain IP ports, or how the encryption is applied, and who can rotate keys and how that all works. You need to make sure you're all talking about the same thing. We did think that the registered entity should be updating their information protection program, cybersecurity awareness, and SIP training material to address the nuances specific to cloud environments and services. Mainly the fact that they work from anywhere. Okay, you may or may not need, VPN access or that kind of stuff. There are some things that can come up that we felt that would be good to add into your protection program and training, so that your users understand that there are some differences between a cloud and not a cloud. Mainly, it's like, well, it's not just at my desk; it's also on my phone, right? Or it may be on some terminal in the airport that's connected to a slot machine in Vegas. You know what I mean? You have to understand and let your users be aware of what they're connecting to. All right. You can't expect a deep dive into the methods used to protect BCI in storage, at rest, in transit, and in use. Now, I haven't heard Alice screaming yet about in use. I know that there's going to be some hollering about in use. Okay, and the term I think has gone away now, right? So the in use, because it ended up just being kind of an intractable metaphysical term in the end, right? But there was a lot of discussion at the time about what is the in use happening. But really, I think what's most important here is that talk about if it's at rest, how is it protected? And how is it not just protected from unauthorized access from the entity standpoint, but from the CSP's standpoint? What processes does the CSP have in place to protect that? Okay, and the different vendors, I know that Amazon approaches that very differently than Microsoft. So there is one example of where the entire approach taken by the CSP can vary widely, which is why, again, we're coming up with this idea of you should test it yourself for your setup. All right. Encryption key management, that ended up being a pretty good discussion about how that works. It was a matter of what can the CSP tell us about the methods they use, what is the encryption level, what protocols are they using, how is that controlled, what do you do in an emergency, in a break glass scenario, what do they have anything in place, or are you on your own? It depends. on probably what you want. And you can go either way with that. I just said access control, Active Directory, including synchronization between, if you use Active Directory for access control, because, you might want a role that says this cloud environment has this access role, and I'm going to authorize that. That's how I'm going to track it. So I know who has access to that. Okay. That also means, how is Active Directory synchronized? Are there holes that could occur between those two when they talk to each other? If it's a federated, if by chance it happens to be a federated Active Directory. Okay. There was a lot of questions about that. The auditors have varying amount of familiarity with Active Directory as well, which is something else to keep in mind, because it's not, Active Directory is not necessarily a simple thing to manage or be able to explain. Okay. Morgan knows everything about Active Directory. By the way, I'll just mention that right now. Okay. Morgan's a genius. Security control considerations, not called out by the SIP standards. So data sovereignty. What does this mean? Well, okay, my data in the cloud can exist in pieces and in bits in locations that you have no idea where they are. That might be spread across the entire continental United States. Well, is part of that in China. It's part of that in Canada. It's part of that in Japan. Well, you better find out, because that will probably be asked. There are certain requirements in FedRAMP and some of the other security frameworks that require continental US. But then you have to also think about things like disaster recovery and how is it split between the different regions. So that was an interesting conversation there. And we had to show that if we set up an environment that we had certain policies that were automatically applied, that would not let you accidentally create those environments or let them replicate, except outside of the little bubble that you needed to have. Okay, so and again, that's where I would go as an auditor too, is you want to ask about these things. No, there is not a standard requirement for it, unless you start talking about the security objectives. It just depends, right? To quote some of the other presentations, it just depends. How unauthorized access to BCSI is prevented after the cloud services are terminated. Some vendors might keep your data for 6 months as a safety measure. Well, who can get to that data when it's sitting there? How do you get to it if you've already nuked all your encryption keys and stuff? So what's the state of that data? How do you get it back if you need it? How do you get it? Transfer it to another cloud service provider. Okay. That has to be understood, especially if it's your BCSI. There could be something important in there that you need, like, I don't know, your disaster recovery plans, maybe, right? Stuff your operators use to recover from black start. These are things you want to make sure that you know what is happening to that data when you terminate the contract. And then the last one, any CSP certifications that are relevant to the controls or protections, and are those being tested, right? And also, I'll mention this too. Like FedRAMP has something called a third party assessor, and they come up and they do the 3-year assessments of all the controls, right? And then you get a report as a FedRAMP customer. You better be able to read the report and show that you get the report and then it's reviewed, because if there's a gap that they have, guess whose gap that becomes? It becomes your gap, probably. So what are you going to do about it? Do you have a mitigation plan for it? Do they have a mitigation plan for it? And are they getting it done? I personally see that as being a lot on the entity to track to make sure that the CSP is meeting their requirements for that. Right. So there's some subtleties there. Again, though, is all this insurmountable? I know I'm talking a lot and I'm jamming a lot of information down your throats, but none of this is impossible. It's just stuff you need to be aware of, and then take some actions to go ahead and deal with it. A schematic or a compilation of the environment is going to be needed for the auditor to understand the environment. So if you have some charts, some network diagrams, something visual that can maybe show where the demarcs are between your organization and the CSP, probably a good idea. And then we actually come up with some stuff that we weren't able to answer during the tabletop that we would see if we can take it further. Whether the use of data or computing is the same as use of BCSI. All right, this goes back to the definition, but this is what came out of it. And then whether documentation related to any relevant CSP certification associated controls could be utilized to prevent direct evidence, provide direct evidence. So, we get the reports from FedRAMP. Microsoft was not too nuts about us releasing that to you guys for an exercise, but in a real audit, we would have to show them some of those private documents, which are very tightly controlled for that. So the product that we have is going to be called a technical reference package. That's because otherwise we collide into a whole plethora of NERC types of products that they, this is not compliance guidance. It's not, if you do this, you will be compliant. It's not like that. Okay. It's not a formal lessons learned either, because right now it's just an experience. It's just a first shot at what happens. Okay. So it is version 1, right? But at the same time, I know I hit the key takeaways, which that was just the summary. We got like 10 other pages of key takeaways divided down in the various categories that you're going to be able to look at when this comes out. Okay, so there is a lot there. There's been a lot of people that put a lot of work into making this happen. So I just want to say that up front. It ended up being a blend of risk and compliance questions and answers because we're trying to learn. So it might start with a compliance question, but then it kind of drops out of some obvious risk things that are going to come out. And that's what some of the stuff that Morgan's going to address here in a second. And then everyone participated in learning. So it was a valuable exercise. If you walk away smarter and not dumber than you were before, hey, that's a victory in my book, right? And the fact is that we're going to have to start doing this as an industry. We are going to have to do this. Someone's going to have to be able to step out and actually start doing some things so that we have some stuff to look at and understand and that we can refer to. And also lastly, as I said, the vendor did get to experience, they got to experience what a NERC assessment is like. And it is not like stuff that they had done before. And I don't mean that in some spooky, scary way, but NERC has some demanding requirements for evidence, and you guys want to get to the bottom of it. And at times, Microsoft, that was a new thing for Microsoft. So this is basically a quick list. This is in your slides. I don't know how we're doing on time. I want to make sure we're doing about. But for, so I'll move it along here. But these are the basic, these are the headings that are in the document package that you can see. There's an agenda, there's backup procedures in the middle of your, if you enter a virtual audit and it collapses, what do? We had phones as backups, what your deliverable package it is, tips and tricks for actually putting the exercise together. Again, a lot of good stuff in there that when it comes out, we think that you guys will have at least a good read that'll put you to sleep fast, and then you wake up and you can hit it again, right? But it's not too long. The idea here is that it was meant to be of value to the industry and cover things that we are interested in when it comes our time to have our cloud stuff looked at. All right. It's being submitted for review right now for the December RSTC meeting for them to review. And then we'd like to get their stamp of approval. I have my rose-colored glasses on. That it's going to be a perfect, great package. They're going to understand everything's going to be perfect. And then March, it'll be approved. And at that point, it'll be posted. So it's a package. They will be probably posted together, and we're going to make sure that they're read together because they do refer to each other because there are different owners. There's part of it that's owned by the CSP. There's parts of it that are owned by the SWG, the Security Working Group. You need to have a little bit of coordination. The process document will teach that, but we got a lot of that dirty work done about how that works. So that's not something that the next entity to do this is really going to have to deal with. And then the last slide, detailed tips, and I'll just let you guys read the list here. You have the slides in your laptops already. And so, like I said, there is a lot of good stuff there. I do want to do one more plug also for the NERC Security Working Group, which was instrumental in helping us make this happen. It's if you guys are interested in cyber or physical issues, come and send me an email if you're interested in getting some of the more interesting products that we have. Morgan's going to talk about one in a minute. The idea behind the Security Working Group is we have small, contained little projects that you understand what you're going to get into, that has a beginning and an end, and then you can finish it and then you're done. Okay. And it's not managed like a lot of the other groups, the other working groups are at NERC. It's just the way I like to run things. And me and Catherine Street are the co-chairs of this group. We're doing a lot of interesting things in that group. We meet every second Thursday of the month. I would encourage folks, if you want to get on the meeting meetings on this group. This is the kind of stuff that we do. We're very, very focused on trying to get value out there, and trying to figure out what burning questions are there out there for the industry. And we want to get those answered for you. Okay, I'm going to hand it over to Morgan. Take it away, man.
Thank you. We'll stay on up.
Yeah.
So this part of the presentation is lifted from NERC's work that's been passed through NERC Legal, and that's what will be included in the package that moves on to the RST. Oh, excuse me. Go. Okay, so in the RSAW narratives, oops, I got hit. Give me a moment. Okay, so in the RSAWs, there was a narrative related specifically to the controls that the cloud service provider was affording for that underlay environment that they control and operate. And then there was also the narrative of what the entity was implementing in that overlay environment, the software environment in which they purchased, they are moving their BCSI into. And so just an overview of SIP 4 for training on BCSI handling. The cloud service provider pointed to being FedRAMP certified. They pointed to NIST 800 or NIST SP 853 Rev 4, where they utilize awareness and training, and that's how they were assisting the, giving the assurance that, they could meet the security objectives. And then the entity also had their training specifically to BCSI in the cloud environment. For part 4.3, for access to designated storage locations, this was a topic of discussion related to when we're reviewing the evidence and some of the documentation we came across where the cloud service providers admins activities are all tracked, which is great. However, it seemed to imply that they had access to the tenant environment. And so after further discussions, this was about Azure's JIT process, which is just in time. So essentially a tenant can, they might have an issue in their environment and they need assistance from the cloud service providers admins. And so the discussion was, how does this actually operate? And is it outside the purview of the tenant or not? And so this process actually, the tenant requests the access, controls the access, and that's really the discussion. But I guess from the exercise and from the SIP standards is, does an entity, are there controls that a cloud service provider could actually have access to the tenant environment, but not necessarily the BCSI, and that would necessarily depend on what other controls are protecting the BCSI, around it. But that was a topic we've discussed extensively. Verifying access, part 4.4. This was related to Azure's Active Directory Connect Sync, or now they moved it to calling it Cloud Sync. So essentially the entity had evidence that they are utilizing their on-prem Active Directory, as Brent mentioned, and it's a push mechanism. So the roles and the controls are pushed to the cloud tenant environment, and they're able to verify the access, control the access to the environment in the BCSI, and that's the same control utilized for revocation.
So Morgan, I got one thing I want to ask you too. So when you see the red X, does that necessarily mean that we would have been non-compliant? Because I don't think so.
No.
It was questions that we had to get answered kind of after the exercise, and we had to explore more. So let's make it clear. Again, this is not an audit.
Yeah.
It's just stuff we're exploring.
Yeah, there was, the sounding board was obviously, we have regulated standards that we're considering, but there's also the risk consideration. And so it really is, this created other RFIs. So initially it was, okay, this isn't going to work. And then as we get more evidence and what capabilities in the RF2, and you'll be able to put this package together and see more of this. But it's really, there's the compliance, and then there's the security risk of consideration. Oops. Excuse me, let me move back. Okay. So SIP 11 for methods for identifying BCSI. So just as on-prem, if you don't identify, how do you ensure you're protecting what you haven't identified? And so there's real value in not just identifying as on-prem or external, but actually identifying it specific to the environment that it's in, the service that it's utilizing. And this really gets into having procedures and controls that are commensurate with the risks in the environment. Okay. So to your point, we had a lot of discussions about risk considerations. And, we took the approach, this is as expensive as a cloud controls model from the Cloud Security Alliance, but we took these categories, risk categories, and had multiple questions. You'll see through this, we first address generally each topic, and then we get specific and review what we saw based on the evidence that was provided. Oh, want to back up one more thing, one more point on this. So you're going to see there is neutral, and neutral really is stating what you'd expect to see. You'd want this provided from the cloud service provider. And then there are controls above and beyond, and those are risk reducing. And then some of them are actually risk increasing if they're not available. Okay, so business agreements. Certainly business agreements is one aspect of having assurance that the controls are going to be implemented, that the cloud service provider is going to meet their obligations for creating a secure environment in that underlay environment, and also what controls will be available in the overlay environment. So a couple things here, as you'll notice in the neutral, vendor access to any data, there's governance around that. Entity specific data disposal methods, there's isolation of the entity environment and notifications of a breach. And then as we reviewed the evidence, some of the things you can see, the entity provided sufficient evidence demonstrating multiple things that you would expect to see in a cloud service provider's environment. Any of those to hit on, or you good?
Just to make sure too, is that again, this is the business agreement, right? So this is the thing, these are the things that define what your service looks like. These are the things that tell you how things are going to work between you and your CSP. A lot of important, interesting parts of that is the DMARC, which is what will they do if there's a, let's say you have some sort of an incident, and what will they not do? Right. So that's one of the bigger issues. And this is, if you look, this is one of the reasons why they're going in here and looking at these agreements, because right now the agreement is really the main control that you have over a cloud service provider is what's in the contract. Right. Cloud service provider does not want to assume liability for things, and they don't want to, they want to be able to meet and complete activities that they've committed to do in the contract. But that's one of the big things that we have. And I think there's a varying level of comfort with that. We know that. That's out there. That's why we had to explore this, because is an agreement enough? It's not a technical control, right? And everybody loves technical. We all know, we all love technical controls, right? So there was they did go into and break down, look through these agreements to make sure that these risk factors and that those things were understood and signed off on by the right people.
Thank you. All right, as Brent mentioned earlier, BCSI in use. You've probably been part of discussions getting wrapped around the axle of what it is or isn't. During this exercise, we took the approach of data that is processed in real time by a cyber asset and not at rest or in transit. So again, some controls expected that would reduce or actually increase the risk generally for cloud service provider environments. So again, what we saw in the evidence provided was expected confidentiality agreements, access that is granted the vendor admins is tracked, as I mentioned earlier, related to the JIT process. Credentials automatically expire after a period. And then what are the trusted services? As Brent mentioned, you know, where's your data in an environment with regions, availability zones? You know, what is the assurance that and what services are utilizing your data?
And what services help manage that? And what do they need access to? And this gets interesting if you start talking about virtual servers that are sitting in there. And this is some of the stuff that the sites group at NERC was starting to approach, is that's why we started here, because this can be a slippery slope and an iceberg that you can get down into. And there's a lot of unanswered questions about that when it comes to actual virtual servers, which the 2016 group is struggling with, and all that stuff. I should say struggling. They're doing good, but there's a lot to work through there. Let's just put it that way.
And just for those that are not familiar with sites, it's the security integration and technology enablement. And so it's another group like the security working group, but they're currently working on some technical papers related to BCSI, or excuse me, BROS function and other aspects of the cloud environment. Okay, so another risk consideration or category was the service model. And really this comes down to the shared responsibility model. So the shared responsibility model for cloud service provider environments is understanding where the cloud service provider responsibilities are in that underlay environment, and then what controls and where your responsibility as a tenant start. So it is a shared responsibility of security. And that's really the aspect of ensuring in our review of this, is that the entity understood and the available controls that were available in that tenant environment. And as see here, there's several things neutral that we would expect. The employees do not have access to customer data by default. The environment is logically isolated. And then, as Brent mentioned earlier, the AD sync, you know, we observed an aspect of this is like, when does the sync take place? And if there were updates to the actual on-prem and not actually in the cloud service provider's environment. And one thing we thought would be helpful was a full configuration export of service of the environment, but it was not available. Okay, encryption. So in encryption, back to the shared server or the shared responsibility model, you know, understanding what encryption is available in the underlay environment, and also what is available in the overlay environment based on the service you're utilizing. Any topics on that related?
Just that there was a lot of discussion. We had decided on what service level it was. We had to be able to show how we manage that using the cloud tools, how we detect changes to that, and who can rotate keys, for instance. And that gets back into your access control system. Was there a role defined for that? So that was some of the questions that we got into and were able to demonstrate during that part of the exercise.
Not moving on. Sorry. Before that next slide. Is it?
There.
Okay.
Went to.
Okay. Okay. And the encryption related to the entity's environment and evidence that we identified, several things that were implemented that would be expected in this environment. And then also managing the keys. The customer was managing the encryption keys in their tenant environment. Okay, certifications. There's been a lot of discussions around certifications. The yellow book, the GAGAS yellow book, allows for the use of the work of others, utilizing the work of others. So this kind of brings up certifications where do we trust, what certifications, what level of certification for a cloud service provider do we expect that we say, okay, now the ERO, we trust the underlay because of these or this certification. And, you know, in this engagement, you know, it's a lot of discussion around FedRAMP moderate. As Brent mentioned, the 3 PAOs, that's a third-party assessor organization, and they, you know, provided a lot of evidence for the cloud service provider. And so some of the things, you know, that would be expected related to certifications. And the evidence was things around the ISO, as I mentioned, FedRAMP. And one thing, the latest certification report's unavailable for review due to sensitivity. And that's, yeah, that was one.
That'll be on a case-by-case basis if you say to do that. So had that been an actual audit, you know, that would probably need to be something that would be provided in a very controlled way.
Yeah. Okay, data sovereignty was the next risk consideration. And we kind of briefly mentioned this earlier. But, you know, it's one thing to be considering the cloud, but as Brent mentioned earlier, this week is where is my data and what controls are available to ensure you know where your data, your BCSI resides. And so what we observed is there was policies to control the where the data resided to enforce the geolocation. All right, so data transformation was the last risk consideration. So more specifically, this is ensuring there are controls for data in the collection, the organization, the process of data, the reporting, and the utilization. And that's where we looked for these controls. In the evidence, the vendor contractually commits to deleting entity data backups and cache data after customers' disassociation with the vendor. Okay, yeah, something we would expect. And then a vendor provides steps for customer data deletion prior to the service cancellation. But this is one thing that we noted was business agreement suspending customer data for a waiting period after disassociation. So what methods are available? You want to terminate the use of the service and you're going to disassociate, but now there's this aspect that your data is going to be held, who owns the data, what's controlled. So, I mean, some things to think about is possibly recycling your keys before the disassociation. Any other thing you recall from the discussion here?
No, that was pretty much it.
Okay.
I think so on that one. Given the fact that we had no plans to disassociate, we had, I think what we had, and there was a disagreement as to what happens. And then after that, we're going to have to probably strengthen that end of it if we're going to look at that.
All right. So a summary of the risk really was around access, certifications, and data transformation seem to be the bulk of the risk discussions. Again, just to reiterate, we're hopeful and want to thank Brent, Al, the other 12 SMEs from WAPA that really moved this effort forward, and those from the security working group. And we're hopeful that, you know, an entity will be able to pick this up and move it through another tabletop exercise.
So we lose anybody yet? Did everybody get their email checked and their phones answered? No, making sure. Okay.
A couple references here that are provided. And then this is the mapping, kind of the things that we reference, and it'll tie into the other packages that Brent is submitting. So, all right.
Well, great. Thank you, gentlemen. I think you can hear me. Am I on the lab right here? Okay, great. So excellent. There's a lot of questions that have come in and we are out of time. I'm gonna ask one quickly because it seems to be generating the most interest. For Microsoft Office 365 and SharePoint Online, they offer a quote customer lockbox. Is this sufficient control to keep from roping in Microsoft people into the SIP4 standards, or would encryption still be required with the entity holding the key?
So this is one aspect. Looking forward, where we are with SIP 4-7 and SIP 11-3 is we're now in this provisioned access. So again, the provisioned access is what the entity in the overlay provisions, that keeps us out of the underlay environment. And that was the whole purpose of the SAR and moving in SIP during this engagement. The issue was, what are the controls available in that underlay environment for the cloud service providers admins? And then this led to the practice guide, the BCSI practice guide. But we don't want to rely on the practice guide. We want standards that we can all meet in ensuring the protection. But that's really what moved it forward.
Great.
But we'll get on the WOVAP and answer more of the questions, please.
Sure, and that's great. And I was going to also offer, because we have the Western Interconnection Roundup, we named it that way in part, so you could round up the speakers today and ask more questions too. But appreciate the follow-up for the HUVA, and thanks so much to both of you for this great discussion today.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.